stark fact remained that people with disabilities were still victims of segregation and discrimination, and this was intolerable. And today's legislation brings us closer to that day when no Americans will ever again be deprived of their basic guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law on July 26, 1990. It was created by several people and was signed by many people, most notably President George H.W. Bush. Around 43 million Americans had one or more disabilities at the time the ADA was written. Those disabilities include mental retardation, mental illness or history thereof, learning disabilities, and physical limitations including using a wheelchair. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, was made to bring equality to Americans with disabilities. Its purpose, as stated at the beginning of the Act, includes providing clear, strong, consistent, and enforceable standards addressing discrimination against individuals with disabilities. The ADA covers discrimination against people with disabilities in the areas of employment, public entities, transportation, public accommodation, commercial facilities, telecommunications, and miscellaneous provisions. The ADA is made to provide accommodations for Americans with disabilities. The ADA states under Section 12102, definitions, the term disability means, with respect to an individual, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of such individual, b, a record of such impairment, or c, being regarded as having such impairment. For such individuals who are defined under the ADA as an individual with disability, reasonable accommodations must be made.
There are accommodations that can be seen, such as signs with braille on them and wheelchair ramps. However, there are also accommodations that are less visible, such as those made in employment. An example of a reasonable accommodation made in employment is special machinery, such as this one, that helps employees who are deaf or hard of hearing. The EEOC is a government-run group that ensures and enforces rights for people with disabilities while informing employers. In an interview with Commissioner Feldblum of the EEOC, she explained the EEOC's role in employment.
So our job is to make sure that the law is enforced. People with disabilities were being shut out of jobs, were being presumed to be unable to do jobs just because of their disability. And they knew that wasn't right. They knew they could work. So their reaction when the law was passed, and that's a copy of the law, the first page and the last page of the law right behind me, I've had it framed and in my office ever since the law passed, was their guarantee, legal guarantee, that they would be taken on their merits in the job.
Because of the regulations of the ADA involving employment, nowadays people in workplaces are more accepting to people with disabilities. For people with disabilities to get to their jobs, accommodations and transportation have to be made because people could not travel by their car or add modifications because they were complicated and expensive. Another transportation regulation is that certain types of intercity rail transportation are required to have at least one wheelchair accessible car. Accommodations were also added to public places to better suit the needs of all people.
You know, there weren't people who were against the concept of giving people with disabilities a fair chance. But as with any bill, any law, there are details. And so we have requirements that people with disabilities be given accommodations. It doesn't help to say, fine, you're blind, we'll hire you, but by the way, we're not going to give you the technology you need in order to read off the computer. That's no help. So there were money costs attached to the ADA, and people always get a little crazy when their money costs. So there were things that we had to negotiate with the business community, with the White House, the then Bush, the first Bush, George Bush White House, that we had to work out. So it did take a year and a half to get the law passed, and that's because we had various negotiations.
So people weren't really against the Americans with Disabilities Act. They just didn't want to put in extra effort into people with disabilities.
Yeah, and that was the act, right? Though the act required the accessibility, the act required certain, steps to be taken, and so we had to negotiate what would those steps be so that it was balanced, so that businesses wouldn't go out of business. That doesn't help anyone, people with disabilities or people without disabilities. So there was a matter of balancing the costs and the requirements.
Although many people benefited from the ADA, there were areas in which it was lacking. For example, 66% of Americans with disabilities between the age of 16 and 64 want to work but are unemployed. With time, the ADA has made additional improvements. For example, a 1986 survey showed that 49% of respondents with disabilities thought lack of transportation access had a negative effect on their social interactions, whereas a 2004 survey by the same people showed only 31% of respondents with disabilities saying this, an 18% improvement. Like all aspects, if there was a need for a change to make it more accessible, then accommodations need to be made. Accommodations in transportation were made, such as adding wheelchair ramps to the buses. Prior to 1990, there were other groups that were getting laws passed that would help the equality issue in the United States, such as the Fair Housing Amending Act of 1988, also known as the FHAA. The FHAA prevented people from declining housing to people with disabilities based on their disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 expanded upon the housing aspect of discrimination, although it was not the main concentration.
As accommodations were changed in public areas to make the lives of many people with disabilities better, it not only improved lives in the 90s, but it created a basis for people to create more regulations to help people in disabilities. Several amendments were created afterwards, such as the ADA Amendments of 2008. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 revolutionized accessibility and ease for people with disabilities all over the United States by reforming the current laws.